Good afternoon. Welcome to Ask the SCSA Wednesday webinar. My name is Justin Brooks, Safety Advisor for the SCSA. I'll be acting as the moderator and the presenter for today's webinar. Before I start the presentation, I just wanted to take a moment to discuss a few items before I get going. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for later viewing on Facebook and our YouTube channel. So if you're not following our social media accounts, make sure after this webinar, you give this video a like and a share and follow our pages to keep up to date on safety in Saskatchewan. All right. So today we're going to be talking about the 10 factors that influence risk tolerance. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get this rolling as soon as I share my screen. So just so you are all aware, at the end of every factor, there will be discussion questions. So these are great to use in different toolbox meetings and that kind of stuff. So I'll explain that as I get into this here. So oftentimes when a near miss or incident happens, the discussion generally centers around why the decisions that led to it were made. How could this have happened when we invest so many dollars into safety? This presentation discusses the 10 factors that influence risk tolerance. The goal is that this presentation will help you understand why certain levels of risk are accepted in the first place. At the end of each factor, there are a series of discussion questions that you can use to open the floor to your employees and the management team to further understand how these factors may influence the level of risk acceptance in your company. So let's begin. Factor 1, overestimating capability or experience. Factor 1 relates to a belief that one's physical ability, strength, agility, reaction time, and reflexes can be utilized to prevent an incident. This is overestimating capability. This factor also relates to situations where an experienced worker will rely on their years of experience and their knowledge of a task as justification for doing the work a certain way, a way that may in fact have higher risk. We deal with this factor in two separate parts. First, we'll address overestimating capability, and second, we will address overestimating experience and knowledge. Overestimating physical capability is the belief that incidents and injuries won't occur because the worker has the physical capability to exert extreme forces and their body is in good enough shape and condition to withstand them. This can be a characteristic of a younger worker who is in good physical condition and has had situations where they have indeed exerted extreme forces without injury. This could be possibly in a gym, activity, or in another job completely. It may involve lifting loads beyond the recommended guide, pulling on tools or exerting forces on equipment. It may involve situations where reflexes, speed, reaction time, and agility are viewed as ways to prevent an incident. So here's an excerpt from a near miss to demonstrate the point. Obviously, it's in jest, but a good example of this fact. So there's ice built up in front of a door that caused slippery conditions. As I walk, my foot slipped, calling upon my cat-like reflexes to spring into action, probably saving my life. A lesser person may have been killed. So obviously this is something that's made up, but this is actually how some people view their ability to react to a certain situation. Overestimating experience can evolve over time, and in many cases, years. Past experience of the task or in a situation is relied upon as a method for preventing incidents. The belief is the task won't go wrong or result in an incident due to the experience of the individual to prevent it from going wrong or knowing exactly what to do if it does go wrong. For example, a worker may feel comfortable or safe over pressuring a piece of equipment, say a tank or a hose, because they know the equipment has been pressure tested above the working pressure, and previous occasions where working pressure was exceeded did not result in an incident. Similarly, years of driving experience can build confidence in one's driving skills, but then when a worker is exposed to something that is slightly different, skill may not be there in that situation. For example, years of experience driving on pavement does not provide the experience needed for driving on gravel. Also, the past experience may not be exactly related to the current conditions. Closely related to overestimating capability, the worker may not be able to execute the skill the way they did in the past. A worker who had hurt themselves shoveling snow stated during the investigation, "I've been doing this for 35 years. I don't understand how I would have hurt myself." Facts being 35 years ago, the worker was 20 years old and in great shape. And today they're 55 years old with possibly deteriorating back, stomach muscles. Past experience is not related to today's situation, and risk tolerance has increased. There are three key strategies for addressing the risk tolerance factor. First, reflect on your role as a mentor. Is this the way you would teach a new worker to do the task? How would you teach a less physically fit person to do the task so that they would not hurt themselves? Second, acknowledge the physical skills and capabilities of the worker, but then reinforce the correct way of doing the task. Refrain from getting into a debate about the worker's capability, as this could be seen as a challenge or doubt on their capability and may result in them demonstrating or proving that they can do even more. Exactly the opposite of what we want. We also need to identify those situations where the physical capabilities and skills may have deteriorated over time. A company manual, handling, and lifting guide should be the definitive tool for this communication within a company. It shows the safe handling and lifting forces that can be applied and helps the workers understand the safest zones for exerting forces and lifting. It is accompanied with weights of common materials and objects, as well as that workers can line the two components up to reduce the risks. So the intent of these next slides are to generate group discussions on very specific issues in your workplace where risk tolerance factor may be an issue. Action items to address these should be documented with responsibilities and timings defined. So first, are there loads in our workplace that require us to exceed the manual handling and lifting guide? And again, that manual and lifting guide is specific to your company. Is there a task that I've done for many years without incident where I've seen others have incidents with? Are there any similarities in how I do the task to those who have had the incidents? And last, do I know my own physical limitations and capabilities for manual tasks? It's important to ask yourself and stop and think before doing a task. Ask yourself, what could go wrong? How bad could it be? And has anything changed? Think, am I physically and mentally ready? Do I clearly understand my task? Do I have the right tools and equipment? And then act, make it safe, use the right tools, use the right procedures, reduce the risks, and stop if it cannot be done safely. These are all questions that need to be addressed during the hazard assessment process. And it's important to remember that these questions throughout every factor, throughout every job, should be asked. All right, so factor 2, familiarity with the task. Complacency occurs when a worker completes a task successfully many times and has the skill to complete it successfully without thinking. The worker may become aware of the potential hazards of the task due to the multiple successful completions without the hazard being an issue. The worker has developed enough skill to complete the task without being fully focused on the task. So you always have to ask what could go wrong. After multiple repetitions of the task, the question needs to be expanded to what could go wrong this time? How bad could it be? These questions must be asked internally. So a mental process on a continual basis. A process like the JSA can also be used to prompt for stop and think moments, if you choose to call them that, at predetermined times during repetitive tasks. Complacency is due to familiarization, doing repetitive tasks, long duration tasks, getting comfortable working near a hazard. And skepticism of potential hazards is always, there was no incident when I did it this way last time. The potential for work execution without having to refocus or refresh can create a blindness to the hazard and risks, thereby increasing risk tolerance due to familiarity. Complacency is not laziness or lack of interest or job or not caring about the results. Complacency occurs when the skill level is achieved where the task can be completed without the worker being fully focused on the task. A task can be completed based on habit and experience, so repetitive and completed correctly numerous times. Think of the example of the electrician who climbs up and down their ladder several times a day. It's the same task each time, and it's not actually even the main part of their job. So, for example, installing electrical equipment. Having never fallen off the ladder, the electrician may get lulled into a sense of security when the three-point contact in the ladder no longer seems important. I bring this up because years ago I had witnessed a fairly major incident involving something exactly like this. So this is how you can get lulled into that sense of security just by doing something that's not actually the main part of your job, it's a part of your job. Strategies for reducing tolerance. So situational awareness, treat every time like the first time. What could go wrong this time? How would I teach a new person to do this? And then verbalize the task steps of the task while doing it. So let's go through the complacency cycle. We'd actually gone through this with another presentation that we had done completely on complacency. So we'll just use this if you have seen it as a review, and if you haven't seen it, this is a great cycle here. So graphic shows the complacency cycle, which has a general trend that is observed after an incident has taken place. So we'll start at the accident, incident, death location of the cycle and move in a clockwise fashion. Right after the incident, there's an immediate focus on prevention. All cylinders of management are firing at once and are working hard to figure out what the next steps are. This is where they determine the how and beginning the conversations about ensuring it does not happen again. Then new policies are developed, and there's training for every member of the team that could be affected. A good management team will ensure there is 100% compliance to the new procedures. Every member is bought in. Then time passes. This could be days, months, or years. Again, this is by no means specific to any event. Depending on numerous factors, whether that be the rotation of employees, new management, or general safety culture, the incident that started this cycle is fading from the minds of the workforce, and the incident is mostly forgotten. Workers become comfortable and familiar with their tasks and then become complacent. And that's when the cycle starts all over again. So some tools for complacency. So some refresher training. So review existing procedures and processes. JSAs complete to a test of skill. Provide feedback, performance observations, conducting detailed hazard assessments. Checklists, so develop checklists, work aids to ensure procedural steps are adhered to during work execution. And then, as I had mentioned before, verbalization. So voice out loud the steps you're completing while executing the task. This may sound silly, but this is a great way of making sure that your mind is on task at all times. So again, here's some discussion questions that you can ask to your workforce. Identify a routine task that you have done more than 100 times in your job. What could happen if you lose focus on this task? How bad could it be? Identify a routine task that you do more than 10 times per day. What could happen if you lose focus on this task? How bad could it be? Identify one task that you will do in the next week where you will use the verbalizing technique. Again, talk your way through the task out loud. And what specific action am I going to take to address this risk tolerance factor? All right, so factor 3, seriousness of the outcome. The risk tolerance is all about answering the question, how bad could it be? This risk tolerance factor deals with the question, again, how bad could it be? It is based on the premise that something could go wrong, but we underestimate or discount how bad or serious the outcome could be. We may believe that a scratch or bruise could be the worst thing to happen, where in fact, it could actually be amputation or broken bones. When the question, how bad could it be, is asked, the true consequences may not be realized due to a couple of factors. It may be because they have been similar incidents in the past, but the resulting damages have always been minor. We may have seen several low-speed vehicle incidents where the results were minor scratches to vehicles. A history of these minor scratches may lead us to believe that's as bad as it could be in a low-speed vehicle accident. Could the outcome be worse if a different piece of equipment was involved? Stepping off the last rung of a ladder and slipping a bit may seem like a slight incident. But what if that ladder led to a landing that held another ladder extending 20 feet to the ground? The second aspect of this factor is the language that we use may trivialize how serious a consequence could actually be. Does a pinch point sound serious? Here's a common example of where our language does not represent the true seriousness of the risk. The phrase pinch points is commonly used throughout our industry to describe situations where a person's hand or body could be caught. The word pinch does not represent how serious this could be. Workers have had hands and fingers amputated in pinch points. Bones have been crushed beyond repair in pinch points. And yes, workers have been fatally injured when caught in pinch points. These situations need to be referred to as crush points or amputation points. This may seem a little out there to be calling certain situations that, but I think the reality is that we do have to stop sugarcoating these. And this is actually going to speak to that a little bit. The strategies for addressing risk tolerance due to not understanding the seriousness of the outcome focus on using your company and industry experience to demonstrate how serious the consequence could be and to change our language so that we do not sugarcoat consequences. Use language that more appropriately describes how serious the outcome could be. So example, again, that's using crush instead of pinch point. So some discussion questions. When you look at these two pictures, ask yourself and your team, how bad could this be? What are the possible injuries? And how is it best to mitigate injuries during these two situations? So for those that are having a little trouble seeing what's happening in the first picture that's on the left, there's a person wearing gloves that does not have their hand on the winch, but we're unaware at what that winch could be either tied to. If something were to stay to, for example, fall, and that winch rope would tighten. So that's just kind of the thing that you're looking at. And the second picture is a winter grid road in Saskatchewan. At least I'm assuming it's Saskatchewan, just due to the sign there and the flat look of the land. So either way. All right. Factor 4, voluntary action and being in control. The risk of an activity or task is viewed as less risky when we engage in voluntary or when we feel we have complete control of the activity. As we go through this risk tolerance factor, we'll use some of the job and recreational examples, as this is where we most often have the choice on what we do and how we do it. As we go through these, we need to constantly relate back to our workplace and consider the workplace tasks where we feel we have full control. These will be the ones where we could be in jeopardy of accepting or tolerating too much risk. Keep in mind that workers are more likely to hurt themselves off the job than on it. There are 3 components to this risk tolerance factor. First, we will have already done a conscious or even subconscious assessment of the risk of the activity or task, and we will have come to our own conclusion, whether it's right or wrong, that the risk is at an acceptable level before making our decision to progress. Pardon me. Once we have established our perception of the risk, we will subconsciously justify our decision with any additional information that is provided. The justification may come from one of the other risk tolerance factors. Most commonly, number 1, overestimating capability or experience. Number 3, seriousness of the outcome. And number 8, confidence in protection and rescue, which we'll discuss later. Second, when there's something we really want to do for personal gain or for adrenaline rush or for the experience, we'll discount the risks associated with the activity to try and justify our participation. And third, when we feel we have 100% control of the task, we'll underestimate the risk. This is usually combined with risk tolerance factor number 1, overestimating capability and experience. For example, many people will make a decision to drive to a location rather than take a plane because they feel they have full control over the driving, whereas they are dependent on others when flying. The level of risk we accept during voluntary activities can be reduced by, number 1, using the hazard assessment process for voluntary and recreational activities will help to assess the actual level of risk associated with the activity. This process, especially when you actually stop the activity to conduct the assessment, is a way of engaging the conscious mind in the decisions on risk. There are times that our perception of the risk is rooted in our subconscious, and the process allows for conscious and critical assessment of our assumptions. And number 2, conducting a hazard assessment is a good way of engaging a broader group in this assessment of risk. The group becomes a sounding board and tested the assumptions about the risk. Someone in the group may have some background, history, or knowledge that can identify where the group does not have full control of the work. I have a friend that actually just last year climbed Mount Everest. He was a lifelong climber, climbed every tall peak throughout the world that I'm at least aware of. He's done at least 8 or 9 of them, and this was his last big climb. And we had chatted about this, about assessing risk and how they do it. And at every point during the climb, they're consistently and constantly doing assessment risks. They're talking amongst the group because everyone has different experience, and they're relying on the experience of their not only their Sherpas but each other to make it through that climb. Anybody that's read into Everest, out of a group of say 10 people, there are generally some people that do not make it back from that trip. This risk assessment is crucial to people making it back from these Everest climbs. So just a little side note there on, not everything is as extreme as climbing Mount Everest, but it's something that should be taken into account. The intent of this slide is to generate a group discussion on a very specific issue in the workplace or in the individual's personal activities where this risk tolerance factor may be an issue. So again, generate a discussion on each of the activities that the workers identify on question 1, or use the pictures to prompt discussion on how the individuals in each of the photos would view the risk of that activity and why. For part 2 of the exercise, generate a discussion on each of the pictured scenarios. So the first one is, which worker would view this risk behavior? Sorry, I'll start again. Which worker would view the risk as being lower? The one who has control of the hammer or the one holding the wrench? Number 2, who has control of the hammer and the holding? Same person. How will they view the level of risk? Factor 5, personal experience with an outcome. This factor is linked closely with risk tolerance factor 3, seriousness of the outcome. If in our past we've had the personal experience of the serious consequence of an activity, we'll have lower acceptance or tolerance for risks associated with the activity. For example, if in our past we have lost a family member or a friend to a fall from heights, we are impacted by that and tend to have less tolerance for not wearing fall protection equipment. A personal experience with a serious or traumatic outcome will stick with an individual for a long time, sometimes a lifetime. It will impact their decisions on similar tasks and usually result in the individual being very tolerant, not accepting of any risks associated with the task. This will obviously reduce our tolerance for the risk and make the task safer. This is a good thing. Our challenge, however, is that not every worker on our site will have personal experience with a serious outcome related to the tasks, and therefore will not have been impacted and may be prepared to take on more risks. As we get a safer operation, even the corporate memory of past lessons from significant incidents may fade and make us more vulnerable to tolerating risks. Again, we went through that with that complacency cycle. Our challenge is to ensure that all workers know that a bad outcome could still happen, even though they may not have seen it personally, and even though this work site has been safe and not seen it. This is especially challenging where new workers or green workers, new to site workers, or new to industry workers may have never seen nor understood how serious outcomes could be. We need to take extra time with the newer workers to ensure they understand how the precautions we take have come from lessons learned in the past. We've learned powerful lessons from past tragedies, and we never want to forget those, whether within a company or lessons from outside work. We need to bring this knowledge forward so that today's workers understand the incidents have occurred and that the procedures, processes, protective equipment, those systems we have in place are to ensure those things don't reoccur. Corporate memory of the lessons learned from past events may be kept alive and relayed to newer workers. This can be done in formal ways through occasional safety meeting topics, using the formal communication reports from those events. It can also be done in a less formal manner when a particular opportunity arises. For example, during a behavior observation on a related task, during instruction on a task, from a prompt in a media article, or from a prompt on a recent industry incident. The purpose is to ensure that workers who may not have seen such an incident are aware that it can happen here, if not for the procedures, pre-job planning, management systems, etc. This process can be used by anyone doing a behavior observation, supervisor, an expert observer, management, or even a worker within the work group who may have had a personal experience with a serious outcome. Here are some strategies for addressing or reducing risk acceptance when there have been no personal experience with a serious consequence. So keep the corporate memory alive. The serious incidents that your company has experienced in the past need to be communicated to newer workers. Supervisors or expert observers and the keepers of corporate memory have the obligation to share their experiences with newer workers. Demonstrate that incidents have occurred because of not following a procedure. Again, that what could go wrong. Demonstrate there have been serious consequences in the past. That's the how bad could it be. Use records and statistics from within the company, from industry associations, and from other companies to reinforce that incidents have and could happen. So the intent of the first question is to demonstrate how a personal experience can have more impact than a generic safety communication. It can be useful to talk to selected workers first to see if they have related experience, and if they're and if they would be willing to share it and help make the point on this risk tolerance factor. Ask the individual to focus on what they learned from the experience and what message they would have for a newer worker to prevent a similar incident. Prompt them to relay how it has impacted their views on safety related to that specific issue. A group exercise like this is very beneficial to new workers. So the first question is there a personal experience that anyone here had that may have a valuable lesson for a newer worker? Is there something we should be doing differently or improving based on this personal experience? What does this mean to me? I have a little spelling mistake there. And what am I going to do about it? All right. So that's halfway through the factors. We're going to start on factor 6 now. This is the cost of non-compliance. All right. A person's decision to accept risk can be influenced by how high the cost of non-compliance will be. The cost of non-compliance, so for example, taking a risk, is going to be very high. The person may decide to conduct themselves in a manner that will not result in cost or penalty. As we go through this discussion on using the cost of non-compliance as a method for reducing the acceptance of risk, it's very important to note that this factor is the only one of 10 and must be used in conjunction with the others. It is not acceptable to choose this factor as a favorite and resort to punishment as a sole tool for reducing risk tolerance. This factor must be used selectively and must be used with an understanding of how to identify and classify performance issues. As the cost of non-compliance increases, the willingness to take chance may decrease. For example, if the cost of a speeding ticket is $200, the driver may accept that that's a reasonable cost and be willing to accept the penalty for achieving the goal of getting there faster, or for the rush of driving at a high speed, or simply to get the job done. If the cost of a speeding ticket is increased to $10,000 and the penalty also includes the impoundment of a vehicle, the willingness to take that chance will be greatly reduced. Another example of how this factor works comes from the aviation industry. This is a highly regulated industry where the cost of non-compliance to safety standards has a high financial consequence on 3 levels. First, fines for non-compliance can be extremely high, including loss of license to transport passengers. Second, the financial loss associated with customers avoiding airlines with poor safety performance. And third, the cost of damage to this very expensive equipment. These high costs of non-compliance to safety standards ensure that airlines have a low tolerance for risk. Aviation risk experts report that some of these very same pilots with low risk tolerance while flying commercially will accept considerably higher risk when flying privately. There is minimal enforcement and minimal penalties for non-conformance. This factor overlaps with the risk tolerance factor number 4, voluntary actions and being in control. A discussion can be generated using this slide on why the risk tolerance be different in the 2 different scenarios. Also ask the question, are there tasks that we do differently in our workplace when we know or we're being watched by a regulator or authority figure? Costs for non-compliance can be addressed at 3 levels. It's important to address the cost of non-compliance at all levels in the corporation, not just at the frontline work level. The company can be impacted by external regulators through fines, penalties, and revoking of the license to operate. So that's permission to be able to operate in that jurisdiction. Loss of the corporate reputation could be a cost where the company sells product. Supervisors and managers who make decisions to accept higher risk or who simply allow higher risk to be taken should know that there's a cost to them for non-compliance. This could mean limitations on promotion. Individual workers must know that there's a cost for non-compliance where the consequences of non-compliance are high. This may include limiting the worker from engaging in a task when the non-compliance occurred. In the case of driving, this may mean limiting or withdrawing the worker's right to drive. The cost of non-compliance must be used in conjunction with knowledge of how to assess and deal with safety performance issues. So when we look at the cost of non-compliance, again, that's that corporate loss of license to operate, loss of reputation, fines and penalties, supervisors, managers, or technical, limitations on promotion and fines, and the individual worker, loss of privileges, limitations on jobs that can be done, loss of pay, and fines. I think across all three of these levels, we see one thing that they have in common, and that's fines and penalties. The penalties or punishment for non-compliance on unsafe acts or conditions can be used. Before this is used, it must be determined that the standards can be applied consistently, that there are no barriers to compliance, and that there are no inadvertent rewards for non-compliance. The penalties can be warnings, suspensions, loss of privileges like driving for an individual, or at the corporate level, loss of contract or work. Sometimes a standard is not Sometimes a standard is not conformed to due to barriers. For example, the requirement to have specific training might not be done because it's not available, just like we've experienced during the beginning of COVID-19. Occasionally, the barrier may be an inadvertent reward, such as positive reinforcement for finishing a job ahead of schedule. This may create incentive for shortcutting and other non-conformances. Positive reinforcement for a task done safely, following the standards with a low acceptance of risk, must be reinforced. This can be significantly more effective and will help the long-term conformance. Some strategies for using the cost of non-compliance as a mean for reducing the acceptance of tolerance of risk are, number one, increase the cost of non-compliance on critical tasks. Be selective and only apply this where a standard can always be applied. Do not use this where exemptions or deviations to the standard exist or have been allowed. Remove barriers that prevent the conformance to standards. Inadvertently rewarding non-compliance can be a barrier. And number three, increase the reward for compliance. Incentives can be used as a positive motivator for compliance. So again, the intent of this slide is to generate a group discussion on very specific issues in your workplace on safety standards that are very important to your staff. If you need a prompt, lockouts can provide a good example. This is a standard that protects a worker directly, and a violation of that standard by another worker, so for example, removing someone else's lock, would warrant a more severe penalty. Use this discussion to also identify standards that are difficult to conform to, or there are barriers to conforming. It's important to understand the concept of erosion of standards to support this discussion. Erosion of standards is where those standards where a standard does exist and a worker is aware of it, but it is not always or maybe never followed. So, discussion questions. Are there standards we have in this company where the risk of injury warrants a high cost penalty for non-compliance? Are there standards in this company that are difficult to conform to? What are the barriers to conformance? And can you identify any examples from work or off the job where an increased cost of non-compliance has been effective in reducing the acceptance of risk? All right. Factor 7, confidence in equipment. Overconfidence in the equipment occurs when we have placed excessive and sometimes unwarranted trust that the equipment or tool we're using will always perform exactly as designed. The possibility that the equipment could in fact fail is not considered, discounted, or minimized. When we become familiar with particular tools and equipment, we've not experienced any failures when we have used them. We can become overly trusting that the equipment or tool will never fail. This factor can be linked to influencing factor number 2, familiarity with a task. Except in this situation, we become familiar with the equipment or tool. When we hear a statement such as, "It has never failed as long as I've been using it," this is reflective that we may be becoming complacent with a particular tool. This factor can also be identified where we hear a particular piece of equipment is fail safe, meaning that if something does go wrong, we expect the equipment will be safe. Fail will correction. We expect the equipment will be a safe failure and nobody will be hurt. A brand new piece of equipment or tool will be perceived as being fail proof. It is new, shiny, and clean. This can portray a message that the possibility of failing is remote. Process equipment often comes with this built-in safety systems that are designed for safe startup, safe shutdown, and warning systems and programs and such that will detect problems and then automatically take care of them. Sophisticated as these devices may be, failures have occurred. Factor 7, overconfidence in equipment, is reinforced through studies done in the US and Britain. In 1995, study on drivers using vehicles with anti-lock braking systems and airbags showed that drivers were more confident and they could stop faster with ABS and therefore tended to drive faster. There was no net gain in the reduction of incidents where braking was a factor. The British study on skydiving revealed that in the early 80s, most of the deaths in the sport were attributed to a parachute not deploying, essentially a flaw with the equipment. 25 years later, with great improvements to this technology of parachutes, the sport was seeing the same number of fatalities. The cause, however, had changed, and it was rare to find a chute that failed to open. The cause now was that the skydivers were so confident that the equipment would deploy that they were not deploying the chute as late as the chute. They were not deploying the chute quick enough, and the chute didn't have time, or at least sufficient time, to deploy. Equipment failures have been replaced with late deployments due to the confidence in the equipment. Train on the limitations of the tools. As an example, do the workers know how much force can be applied to a pipe wrench before it breaks? Teach workers to look for the ratings on the slings and lifting equipment and know the weight of the load to be lifted. Incidents have occurred where the operators were expecting the engineered shutdown systems to look after things if anything went wrong. The shutdown parameters need to be understood, including things like delays, response time of incidents, etc. Workers need to ask the questions like, what will happen if it does fail? When a response to that question is, it's never failed, the hazard assessment process needs to force the discussion to continue. It hasn't failed previously, but what if it does this time? Are we prepared for that type of failure? So, some discussion questions. So again, and I like to repeat this first part because it's very important, that the intent of this slide is to generate a group discussion on a very specific issue in the workplace where this risk tolerance factor may be an issue. So the first one is, do you drive differently or more aggressively on winter roads when you put high quality winter tires on your vehicle? Is there a tool in your workplace that we have damaged from excessive force? Is there a piece of equipment that we push to the operating limits, knowing that if we go beyond the limits of this equipment, it will respond appropriately? And are there electrical circuits that we could use? Are there electrical circuits that we use that could be overloaded, but we expect the breaker to trigger if it is? This last one, in my experience, is C panels on construction sites. These come to mind big time. You would often see in many instances, and anybody that's worked commercial and even sometimes residential, they use these. I see a lot more generators in residential, but in commercial, you'll see the construction panel. And it has a million cords plugged into it. And you've got not only cords that are running, 300 to 600 feet of cord, but you've got batteries plugged in. And the odd time you'll find someone that has plugged in one of the three-way splitters so they can charge 3 batteries because they feel like 3 batteries is less output than 1 skill saw, so they can plug 3 into a 2 switch. It goes on and on, right? Again, even for question number 2, is there a tool in our workplace that we have damaged from excessive force? We've seen that pipe wrench back a few slides ago. Think of every time that you've ever used a snipe. And for those that are unaware of what a snipe is, it's to increase the leverage on something. For example, in that picture of the pipe wrench, I'm thinking that a snipe was probably used or something where you'll have a, say, 36-inch pipe wrench. And you put a 6-foot piece of pipe on it so you can get more force to increase that leverage. Well, that tool is not meant to be used in that way. and to have that much force applied to it. So I want you to really think about those types of things when you ask these questions. Okay, on to factor 8. Confidence in personal protection and rescue. This factor specifically deals with overconfidence in safety and personal protective equipment we use, and the belief that if something does go wrong, our PPE will protect us from harm. This factor also extends to an overconfidence that we'll be effectively rescued by our peers, emergency services, or even ourselves if we get into a bind or risk situation. In this case, a worker knows what the hazard is, understands what could go wrong, but is so confident in being rescued, they'll pursue the task anyway. The research on this factor, overconfidence in protection and rescue, and factor 7, overconfidence in the equipment, were based on the research of Dr. Gerald Wild and the principles of risk homeostasis. Additional input was gathered from the avalanche research of Dr. Bruce Jameson of the University of Calgary. Calgary. I don't know why I always say Calgary. I think it's, I don't know, maybe it's a Saskatchewan thing. So PPE. This factor applies to equipment including personal protective equipment, so hard hats, fire-resistant workwear, safety boots, gloves, safety glasses, breathing apparatuses, detection equipment, fall arrest equipment, life jackets, and the belief that rescue from a bad situation will be imminent and successful, including rescue from a confined space or high angle, emergency response from an internal or external resource, and self-rescue. I know I'm guilty of the self-rescue one. I had taken a pretty major spill up north at one point off a ladder. And my thought prior to that was always I was going to grab onto something and stop myself from falling, which was definitely not the case. I ended up falling about 15 feet off a ladder. Thankfully, I was okay after a few days of rest, but things could have went really, really bad for me. So that was definitely something. This factor, I know in the past I had been very guilty of. So belief in PPE. Several formal studies and workplace observations have shown that people are prepared to accept more risk when they believe their protective equipment will save them if something goes wrong. A British study on back belts revealed that when workers viewed their back-supported belts as protective equipment, they believed they could safely lift greater weights, greater acceptance of risk. Similar behavior has been observed within a company. When many industrial companies went to full-time use of fire retardant workwear, the workers were seen to take greater risks in potential explosive and flammable situations. Incidents occurred when workers would bypass a flame arrestor or burner, knowing full well a flashback could occur, but believing that their fire-resistant workwear could protect them from burns that occurred. Current studies are underway on PPE that has armor-type properties. This is specifically impact-resistant gloves. Workers have stated that certain jobs they can now do with the impact gloves that they would not have felt safe doing with no gloves or general purpose gloves. So for example, holding a post or a hammer or a wrench for someone else to strike a hammer, like we can see in that last picture a few factors ago. Workers who are aware that a rescue or an emergency service may be a long time in arriving have a lower acceptance of risk than those who believe rescue will be immediate. This applies to workplaces and recreational activities. This fact can be used to reduce the acceptance of risk at remote work locations by reminding workers that there are no immediate emergency medical facilities. This fact can be used during certain emergency training, such as confined space rescue. If it can be demonstrated to workers that a prompt and successful rescue may not always be possible from a complex space, this will force more attention to be focused on prevention of the adverse situation in the first place. Similar information is available through research on outdoor adventure activities. The lone adventurer becomes aware that there is no one to perform a rescue and therefore will not take the same amount of risk as a member of a group who is confident that his group will bail him or her out of a bad situation. So, 4 no's. Know the limitations of your personal protective equipment. Number 2 is view personal protective equipment as a last line of defense and ensure that workers understand that it does not have incident prevention properties. Number 3 is know the limitations of a rescue or emergency response. And number 4, visualize the risks of a job and how it would be done if the PPE was not available. So ask yourself, would I do this task differently if there is no personal protective equipment to protect me or no one to save me? So our discussion questions on this topic is, do you place your hands in situations when wearing gloves where you would not place them if you had bare hands? Number two is, have you ever had a situation where your personal protective equipment prevented an injury from occurring? Could the event have been prevented completely? Number three, is there a task that you would do differently or not at all if you knew there was no one available to rescue you or medical facilities were a long way off? And by a long way off, let's imagine that we're talking anywhere from 45 minutes to 2 hours. Number four, do you have any examples of recreational activities where this factor may be at play? Factor nine, potential profit or gain from actions. Companies and corporations are prepared to take more risks when there's more to gain. If a company can make more profit by having more equipment in the field, selling more product, getting more clients, some companies will be willing to do whatever it takes to take advantage of that. This could mean using equipment that has not been maintained, send out workers who have not been trained, and stretching their capabilities to safely deliver their products and services. Companies and corporations can view cost cutting as a gain or contribution to profits. These measures need to be balanced so that decisions on cost cutting do not explicitly or inadvertently send a message that higher levels of risk are acceptable. The decision by managers and supervisors need to be assessed against the risk introduced. Number one, the top example shows lease conditions as an example of this. A risk-based decision needs to be made off the site preparation. Given the nature of the work, is it acceptable to leave the site as it is in the left picture? Left in this condition, it will present an unacceptable risk for the workers on this site. How could the workers prevent slips, trips, or traction incidents through the procedures and being careful? Or are additional measures needed? The photo on the right shows a site that have rig mats been placed to reduce the hazards presented by muddy conditions, a solution that had costs associated with it. And again, rig mats aren't necessarily the only way to handle something like this. I've dealt with these types of sites many times where we've used bamboo matting. We've built just out of wood, platforms out of wood and walkways, depending on the work that needs to be done, right? So there are other ways to handle this. It's not necessarily one with the highest amount of risk. Even sometimes spreading river rock or rock can help. Mainly, I should mention, the rock is mainly for driving, not necessarily walking. That can create its own amount of hazards, especially things like river rock. Creative ways of doing work and reducing costs can be acceptable, but each decision needs to be made based on the level of acceptable risk. There are situations where creative solution or the lack of the right equipment may introduce significant risks. If this becomes a pervasive and continual approach, a culture of high risk tolerance is created, and the higher levels of risk become the workplace norm. The two previous slides focus on the management and corporate decisions that allow higher levels of risk to be accepted. This slide focuses on decisions by an individual worker to accept higher levels of risk. The worker may be prepared to accept a higher level of risk when there is a reward for personal gain for doing so. This could be because of longer hours, means more overtime and more pay. This may be done at the risk of being fatigued on the job. The decision could be impacted by personal needs, so mortgage, loans, lifestyle bills, or may be impacted by the company's need to get the work done, offering higher compensation for the additional work as an incentive. Situations have arisen where workers have compromised on the quality of their personal protective equipment that meant more money out of their pocket. So, for example, not replacing a set of worn out safety boots because they're not due for their boot allowance or no allowance exists. Similar situations have been observed where workers are required to provide their own tools. Linked closely with number one, workers who have been known to take second jobs when they're on days off or days on rest. The worker does not get adequate rest, and the risk of incident goes up. The gain of additional income is viewed as outweighing the risks associated with the fatigue. Finishing a task earlier and being allowed to go home when the task is done may be viewed as a reward for getting the job done faster. A shortcut with the associated risk may be perceived as acceptable in this situation. A shortcut with positive recognition from the supervisor will also be incentive for taking more risk. Productivity bonuses can generate a culture where the risks are accepted in order to achieve the bonus. For example, a pay structure that pays by the square foot is an incentive to hang up more drywall faster. This can result in shortcuts, skipping out on safety requirements, skipping out on rest breaks, and pushing the equipment to the limits, thus raising the acceptable level of risk. As this becomes the norm, higher levels of risk are associated. And it should be known that I have witnessed many piece workers working extremely safety within their means. So this is not to say that piece work at its root is unsafe. It's just sometimes we see these risks that are associated with that type of work. So some strategies for reducing risk tolerance situations that are created by a potential profit and gain from actions include: identify situations where the pay system may be rewarding at-risk behavior. Identify a work where the pay is by the load, volume, ton, square, linear foot, or any other pay method that rewards speed, shortcutting, and non-conformance to procedures. And identify contracts, either corporate or individual, that promote shortcutting through the reimbursement method. Lump sum contracts where there's a fixed cost for the end product can undermine safety principles. Remove incentives for schedule. The incentive could be something as simple as, if you finish early, you can go home. Ensure reimbursement methods for personal safety equipment are not a barrier to replacing worn out clothing or tools. Boot allowances, tool allowances, safety clothing allowances should be adequate for timely replacement or on an as-need basis. When it comes to priority, safety, quality, cost, and schedule. Take note that schedule is the last of the priorities and must never take precedence over safety and quality. So here's some discussion questions. Are there any tasks that we do here where we work, meaning where you work, where there are incentives for getting the job done faster or cheaper? Are there situations in your work group where we have worked extended hours and fatigue may have created risks? Can you identify any examples from work off the job where we can profit our personal gain by not following the safety standards? And number 4, is there an adrenaline rush and personal gain? All right, so now we're on the last factor, factor 10. This one is extremely important, something that during my time working industrial and commercial construction that I had seen a lot, especially myself as a young worker, I had experienced this. So factor 10, the level of risk accepted by our role models and mentors will directly impact the level of risk we as individuals are prepared to accept. The actions and risk assessment for the role models can impact an entire work group's acceptance of risk. To address this risk tolerance factor, it's important to know who the role models for a work group, who they are. For this purpose of this risk tolerance factor, a role model could be a senior worker in the work group that has been in the position for a long time and is viewed as an individual who knows how things are really done around here. The position of role models may have evolved purely from time in the position. There's usually an individual or two in any work group who's viewed as the go-to person when there's an issue or a problem. They're the ones seen to have the answers for the tough questions and will also be the go-to person when there's a safety decision to be made, regardless of authority level. Every group has an informal leader. This position of leadership may not have been assigned by management, but rather has evolved due to the group dynamics. This informal leadership role may be related to seniority or expertise. Similar to point 3, there may be an individual who has the respect of the group for whatever reason, maybe a cultural or social respect, maybe due to expertise, maybe due to a particular action they're known for. A person in a position of authority may be viewed as a role model. Supervisor's actions and methods may be adopted by the group. Some cultures naturally view the supervisor as a role model, or the supervisor may be viewed as a role model for exhibiting some of those other characteristics addressed above. It's important that we know who the role models are for a work group, whether the status is assigned or naturally evolved. For the purpose of addressing risk tolerance, we must understand the risk tolerance for the individual is assigned as mentors to new workers. It's a little old, but in a 2008 safety perception survey conducted by Imperial Oil, they asked 2 questions of their workforce that shows why we must be very selective when choosing mentors for new workers. The first question asked was, are experienced workers chosen to mentor new workers? More than 90% of the workers answered yes. The second question asked was, are safe workers chosen to mentor new workers? Positive answers were less than 60%. This shows that experienced mentors are not always the best safety role models. This risk tolerance factor impacts safety on two levels. First, the way a role model conducts themselves and does a task can be viewed as the way a task should be done with no thought and no conscious decision made about the risk. This is just accepted as the norm and it's not really questioned. This can happen over time and leads to, again, that erosion of standards that we had talked about earlier. The actions of the role model become the group norm and the way it's done around here with no thought of the risk associated with it. Second, even in those situations where the risk of doing a task may be questionable, once a role model has done the task in a particular manner and no incident has occurred, now that becomes the accepted level of risk. This justification is if he or she can do it that way with no incident occurring, the rest of us can do it that way and we will not have an incident either. There may have been no incident from luck, slightly different circumstances, or the casual factors that have just not lined up yet. If we're going to address this risk tolerance factor, the first step is to know who the role models are in the work group. To do this, a supervisor needs to know his or her workers. They need to be able to assess the work group and determine who in the group sets the standards. The person with the formal authority in the group may not be the role model, and this difference must be identified. The mentor assigned to train a new worker must be a safe worker as well as an experienced worker. So when it comes to assessing role models, some strategies for addressing situations where role models accept a higher level of risk is know who the role models are in the group. Assess the group dynamics to identify informal role models. Identify those who have formal roles as group leaders. Assess the risk acceptance of senior workers. Number two, assign mentors that have a proven record of low risk tolerance. 3, erosion of standards is that slow creep over time where a standard becomes loose or watered down. There's no longer being followed as prescribed. This can happen on simple things like how hand tools are used, cared for. It could be complex technical procedures where shortcuts are gradually introduced over time and then becomes the norm. Behavior observations using the procedure, standard, or JSA as a touchstone can help identify where the common practice has drifted from the standards. Behavior observations should be conducted on all workers, including the experienced and senior workers, to determine if shortcuts have been introduced to the task over time. The observation process allows for the immediate feedback on the process. Use behavior observations to reinforce when the role models and mentors are demonstrating the lower risk methods for doing a task or job. Behavior-based safety observations are an integral part of behavior-based safety programs, which aim to reduce the number of incidents by recognizing safe behavior and eliminating the need for unsafe behavior. This general idea is by creating safe work habits through observations, the number of incidents will decrease among the workers. And in fact, I'll talk about this at the very end, but our toolbox talk next Tuesday will actually be on behavior-based safety and kind of what it is. So the discussion questions for this last factor is, have you ever experienced a situation where you've seen a more senior worker engaged in a task that you thought was being done unsafely? How would you address that situation? Would it be an easy discussion to have? Why? Why not? Can you identify a standard in our workplace where you believe we are not following the standard as it was prescribed? And what safety processes or tools are at our disposal to help us approach others and address situations where we believe a role model or mentor is accepting risk that may be too high? All right. So that is the end of our PowerPoint on those 10 factors. It's a lot of information to take in at one time. So obviously, if this is something that you choose to speak to your workers about and present to your workers, it's best done in smaller chunks. You know, if you do maybe at each safety meeting or each toolbox meeting, you go over a few of these factors, and even just a short explanation on what these factors are, and then go into these discussion questions. This is a really good way, especially for if you have new workers around, to hear that these discussions are happening. This really sets the bar on what you as a company believe in when it comes to safety, that we understand that these things exist and that we are all human, we all make mistakes, and each one of us has a different tolerance to risk. The idea behind this is to kind of come together as one company and decide where are issues and what do we need to work on, because we understand, again, that we are human beings and that we all have these different experiences to draw from. So that is it. This concludes our SCSA Wednesday webinar. I would like to thank all of you by watching, participating in these discussions. We're all working together, making Saskatchewan the safest construction environment in Canada. So like I had described, I talked about earlier, make sure you tune in next week for Toolbox Tuesday. I'll be presenting on behavior-based safety. And then next Wednesday, we have Sheldon Fizzard, who is a respiratory therapist, who will be presenting on respiratory hazards. I also want to remind everyone that we have all our webinar presentations available on our YouTube channel. These are a great resource for training and toolbox talks, especially if, like us, you're doing your meetings online. Remember to like and share this video and follow us on all social media platforms. Have a great day, everyone, and work safe.